We literally bought this chicken broth, $5.69, 2 months ago.
Where does it come from? Do you just print it?
We print it digitally.
Average House of Representatives member is something like 12 times richer than the average American household. Once people get elected, they almost always get richer.
The COVID crisis has taken a toll on so many, and yet some people actually profited.
For the first time ever, a president has been impeached twice.
He had an amazing point about civilizations collapsing, and that when they start collapsing, they become obsessed with gender. And he was saying that you could trace it back to the ancient Romans, the Greeks.
The movement toward androgyny occurs in late phases of culture, okay, as a civilization is starting to unravel, okay, and that you can find it again and again and again through history.
It was unprovoked, but this is what Russian President Vladimir Putin unleashed on Ukraine.
A huge blast in the center of Ukraine's second largest city. Look at the destruction in Kharkiv, which is about the size of Philadelphia.
Another $325 million.
BlackRock said that rebuilding Ukraine could take, Crystal, between $700 to $800 billion. And they're pointing specifically to the new partnership where they will advise the Ukrainian government on how to structure the country's reconstruction fund. So you could see this is Iraq and Afghanistan levels of graph.
If you know anything about that, what can you report at this stage?
On Capitol Hill, as House Republicans have passed an emergency funding bill for Israel tonight, providing $14 billion in aid. But it does face opposition from the White House and Senate leaders who also wanted billions in aid for Ukraine in this bill.
Free Palestine! Free Palestine!
And obviously all of this stuff that you're watching, seeing, it's pretty bad because we're getting more and more immune to it. Like it's becoming a normal Tuesday, normal Monday.
I started by asking her whether there are any conditions attached to America's support for Israel given the unfolding humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Her answer to that was very clear. She said, quote, "America stands behind Israel, period." I also asked her whether America could afford to support two foreign wars at the same time, and a similarly clear answer to that: absolutely.
As the Biden administration works to respond to the influx of migrants, our Amna Nawaz was on the border last night.
So they're doing all this training and stuff in Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda and all these international terrorists. Do you think they're going to start coming up through our southern borders?
Well, they've already started.
Do you know that for a fact?
Yes.
How do you know that?
I know that because I was told several different times about group pockets of terrorists, so like 6, 8. There was one larger one, maybe 25 to 50, I think it was 50, that procured passports from the Afghan government with the sole purpose of coming to our southern border.
There has been a record increase in the unhoused population this year.
We are at the beginning of a very classic late big cycle debt crisis.
Social Security reserve funds are going to run out by 2034.
France's president pushed through a plan to raise retirement age to just 64.
The reform is necessary to prevent the pension system from going bankrupt.
Unions stopped picking up garbage and people started protesting. Months later, they're still protesting. All this over being asked to work fewer years than Americans do.
The only other alternative is printing money.
I suspect that's what America will do. The politicians won't face this, but they'll get to the point where they don't have enough. They'll just print more and we'll be like Zimbabwe.
Repos, 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 and more repos.
See this crazy auction prices for cars, so I can show you guys that the car market is actually failing. We're adding. A lot of people are saying, oh, it's tax time, this is the time. No, I'm telling you, people are running out of money. Americans are eating into their savings.
Could this be a sign that everything's going to be okay? If yes, why are CEOs at 84% saying a recession is coming?
For next year, are you optimistic about the global economy or pessimistic?
Pessimistic.
The banking system is built on a house of cards, and it could collapse at any moment. And if it does, the federal government's going to have to come rob you of your money to give to a bunch of bankers again. That's our system.
Around 30 years ago, a book was written that predicted all the chaos that we're going through today. It predicted 9/11, 5 years before it happened. Quote, a global terrorist group blows up an aircraft and announces it possesses portable nuclear weapons.
A big explosion has just occurred. Everyone is running from the entire financial district now.
The United States and its allies launch a preemptive strike. The terrorists threaten to retaliate against an American city. Congress declares war. And opponents charge that the president concocted the emergency for political purposes. End quotes.
You lied about weapons of mass destruction. You lied about connections to 9/11. You lied about Iraq being a threat. You sent me to Iraq.
The book predicted COVID 23 years before it happened. Quote, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention announced the spread of a new communicable virus. The disease reaches densely populated areas, killing some. Congress enacts mandatory quarantine measures, end quotes.
The World Health Organization has just released a report estimating that 15 million deaths occurred globally due to the pandemic.
How did the authors know these things were going to happen? Is it because they found some grand conspiracy? No, they saw all of this coming because of simple, predictable human nature. And all that uncertainty you feel in the air right now, that ever-present feeling of uneasiness where it feels like we're right on the edge of a giant cliff, all of this is going right according to plan. See, in this book, the authors uncovered that history literally repeats itself in 80 to 100 year cycles. These 80 to 100 year cycles are called seculums, and this is not some random number, by the way. 80 to 100 years happens to be the average length of a human lifetime. And each of these seculums are made up of 4 parts, or 4 turnings of around 20 years each. The first turning is a high, an upbeat, optimistic era that happens right after a big crisis like a war. People work together, people trust the government, things are great. But then comes the second turning, the awakening, where people become disenchanted with the status quo. Then comes the third turning, the unraveling. And finally the fourth turning, the crisis. A destructive 20 to 25 year period that ends with a catastrophic event like a war or revolution, where the current order is destroyed and it gets replaced with a new order. And thus the cycle starts all over again. And these cycles have repeated themselves over and over and over again over the past 300 plus years of Anglo-American history. The last crisis we had was World War II. The crisis we had before that was the Civil War. And the crisis before that was the Revolutionary War. And so on and so on. And oh, would you look at that? All these crises are magically 80 to 100 years apart. And you know what that means, right? Extend this pattern out and you'll realize that we are deep into the fourth turning already. And the climax of this fourth turning, that single catastrophic event that's gonna destroy the current order and replace it with a new one, well, that crisis is just a few years away, exactly as destiny intended. What will this catastrophic event be? The best case? Pure economic mayhem that will make the inflation we've been seeing right now look like a walk in the park. The worst case? War. World War. But whatever the case may be, we have a pretty good idea of how things will play out, because we already got a preview of it during COVID. During this coming crisis, the government will print a bunch of money, most of it will go to the 1%, and the little that the masses do get, well, they will immediately transfer that money to the 1% anyways. Just like what happened during COVID, except this time we will see the final form of this wealth transfer, where all that last remaining wealth will get squeezed out of the middle class and get transferred to the 1%. So if you thought the last few years were rough, it's about to get much worse. And if you and your loved ones don't want to get absolutely crushed, along with the rest of the poor and middle class, well, you better start preparing right now. And if you think this won't affect you because you're not in America, well, think again. Because even if there isn't a world war, because of how interconnected the world is today, because every country relies on the dollar, if America goes down, it will bring everyone else down with it. And it will position some countries to profit. So it's time to start preparing. That is why we're doing this 3-part documentary series. In this first episode, we're gonna uncover the cycles of history to understand exactly what is gonna happen next. In the second episode that's dropping this Friday, December 8th, we're gonna go over the principles you need to know to start preparing right now to ensure that you come out of the rubble on top. And finally, in the third episode that's dropping this coming Monday, December 11th, we're gonna go over what I'm actually doing right now to prepare so that you can too. These are by far the most important documentaries I've ever made, so you are not gonna wanna miss them. They're free as usual. All you gotta do is click the link below, put in your name and email, it takes like 11 seconds, and you'll get notified when episodes 2 and 3 drop, and you'll also get access to our private Telegram group on the crisis. That will be linked below. And what is this book, you ask? Why, it's none other than The Fourth Turning by William Strauss and Neil Howe, which we'll also link below. Highly recommend you read it. So sit back, relax, and it's time for our rendezvous with destiny. The year was 1945. World War II was finally over, and America had just come out on top. The young adults at the time, known as the GI generation, had known nothing but suffering. They were raised during World War I and the Great Depression, all to be shipped off to fight in the deadliest war humanity had ever seen. And now it was finally over, and they had come out on top. They came home to be celebrated as heroes, and they were eager to finally enjoy some of that freedom that they so desperately fought for, and enjoy they did. They took that same work ethic, patriotism, and fear of death that helped them win the war, and they put that energy into American society. They took over jobs, they got married, settled down, and had kids. They ushered in an era of prosperity, unity. Everyone was on the same page, and there was political stability. The family was stronger than ever. The gender roles between men and women were stronger than ever. Trust in the government was higher than ever. Politicians, for the most part, actually took their job seriously. Very different from today. Conformity was higher than ever, as the masses happily fell in line with 9-to-5 jobs and white picket fences. There were no culture wars or infighting with each other. They had already fought over everything worth fighting for. The future really did look brighter than ever, and thus the GI generation, or the hero generation as we'll call it, propelled America into the fastest period of growth ever. The first turning the high. New inventions were being made left and right. Consumerism and mass marketing was now a thing. The American dream with its suburbs, tract homes, its love affair with cars and appliances was alive and well. And the dream of just having to work a 9-to-5 job at the same company for your entire life, and the company will take care of your retirement, it actually worked during the high. Everyone was getting richer together, no matter if you were part of the lower, middle, or upper class, unlike today. Going to the moon, eradicating poverty, all these impossible dreams now seemed achievable. Social programs were being created left and right. And the crazy part was they were actually working, because everyone believed in the system. No one was trying to game the system back then, unlike today.
Hi, I'm a recovering crackhead. This is my retarded sister that I take care of. I'd like some welfare, please.
But nothing good lasts forever. See, while the GIs were being hailed as heroes, the generation beneath them, the silent generation, had a much different experience. See, while the GI generation were fighting the Great Depression and World War II, the silent generation were just kids during all of this. And as you can imagine, growing up as a kid during a depression and then a world war is gonna be very different. Your parents are gonna be super overprotective of you since you know it's war. The adults are at war, you don't have any right to complain. You're gonna shut up, go to school, get a stable job, and you're gonna toe the line. That was the average experience of a kid growing up during the Great Depression and World War II. Quote, most of us kept quiet, attempting not to call attention to ourselves. To be a teenager was nothing but the lowest of the low, end quotes. And when the war heroes returned home after World War II, all the praise and spotlight was on them, and the silent generation were further cast into their shadows. Now imagine an entire generation being raised like this. You're gonna have an entire generation of conformists that are all gonna grow up, they're gonna end up hating themselves for conforming their entire lives, so they're gonna try to find themselves. They're gonna try to express themselves, and it will give birth to cultural icons, like the Beatles, Andy Warhol, Jimi Hendrix. That's why this type of generation is called the artist generation. But while the artist generation quietly conformed to their parents' expectations, all the kids who were born just after the war did the exact opposites. See, by the end of the 40s, all those war veterans were having kids left and right. And as the hero generation who conquered the crisis, who went through all this hardship their entire lives, who now have everything they've been fighting for, if you were one of them, how would you raise your kids? I'm gonna give my kid everything that I didn't have. I'm gonna give them all the opportunities I didn't have, all the freedom I didn't have. I'm gonna make sure that they don't go through any hardship, and it's gonna be amazing. In other words, as the hero generation, you are gonna spoil them. So imagine this, but scaled up to the entire nation. That is how the GI generation raised all their kids. That is how they raised the baby boomer generation. The GI generation created good times, and those good times were about to raise weak men. And guess what happened to this entire generation that never had to go through any hardship when they eventually grew up to be young adults? They didn't know what it took to create this high, so they were not gonna work hard and contribute to keep the high going. No, times are great, so they're gonna let loose and party. They're gonna see all the mistakes and flaws of their parents. And instead of understanding where their parents came from, they're gonna rebel against everything their parents created. And even though it was a high, there were a lot of problems being swept under the rug that were worth rebelling about. Women's rights, civil rights, conformity, how you couldn't express yourself, how we were inching closer and closer to war in Vietnam. So as this baby boomer generation went from childhood into young adulthood, it was the perfect recipe for an awakening. There's a reason why this type of generation is called the prophets, because it prophesizes the start of the end. And that awakening would come on November 22nd, 1963. The assassination of JFK changed the mood of the entire nation. We went from a high where everything was all fine and dandy to an awakening where Americans started to question who they were. They started to question the government. They started to question authority. Maybe the government wasn't as good as we once thought. With the GI generation now getting old, they started going into positions of power, and they brought their attitude of I'm the hero so I know the best with them into the government. And with the silent generation becoming middle-aged, they now all had a midlife crisis at the same time, and they hated themselves for conforming their entire lives. And the baby boomer generation? They grew up spoiled, remember? They never had to worry about money, they didn't need to worry about the economy. So instead, the silent generation and the baby boomer generation both found something new to focus on: themselves. The hippie movement, music festivals, LSD and psychedelics, protesting against the war against corporations, protesting for civil rights and women's rights. Nothing too sacred was off the table. Suddenly working a 9-to-5 was joining the rat race. Going to college and getting a degree was smothering your creativity. And following orders like registering for the draft was as good as giving up your free will. If you had asked the GI generation a few years ago if they thought any of these things would happen soon, they wouldn't have been able to believe it, because it was the high. But now it was the awakening. The nuclear family started to weaken, the gap between gender roles was now getting smaller, and society was splintering. And it was all inevitable. On top of that, since the hero GI generation was getting old and entering into positions of power, naturally they wanted to give themselves a ton of benefits. Education, Medicare, urban renewal, conservation, fighting against poverty, and crime prevention were all part of the GI generation's plan to make America a better place. And here's the thing, their argument was reasonable. We won World War II, things have been great, we have a ton of money. The least you can do is take care of us now that we're old, we can totally afford it. But what the hero generation didn't keep in mind was that this new working class generation did not care about working at all. They were rebellious hippies that only cared about finding personal happiness, remember? If they couldn't stay in an unhappy marriage for their kids, why would they ever stay in a dead-end job just because the company or the country needed them to? So none of the spending on social programs would be sustainable. So while America started to pour billions of dollars into social programs, free stuff, America's economic growth began slowing for the first time ever. And suddenly, Americans had to add the term stagflation into their vocabulary. The government desperately needed money. So what did it do?
To take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
In 1971, Nixon took us off the gold standard. See, before, the amount of dollars America could print was limited to the amount of gold it had. But now, the money printer had been let loose. And from 1971 and onward, something really weird happens. The economy kept growing, except it was no longer everyone getting richer together. Now it was only the rich getting richer, with the middle class and lower class basically flatlining to this day. But that wasn't all. Inflation skyrocketed from around 4% at the start of 1971 to more than double that at 8.8% in 1973. By the end of the 70s, inflation will be up to 12%. And while middle and lower class income stopped growing, the middle and lower classes also started getting absolutely shackled in debts. College tuition also suspiciously started skyrocketing after 1971. 1971, this awakening would sow the seeds of the crisis we face today. And as time went on, the artist silent generation started having kids. And remember how the artist silent generation had a rough upbringing during the Great Depression and World War II, and how they were forced to conform their whole lives by the GI generation, and now they were really busy finding themselves? Well, if you were them, how would you raise your kids? I'm not gonna be strict and mean and overprotective of my kids like my parents were to me. I'm not gonna impose my values on them. In fact, I'm barely gonna raise them at all because I'm too busy finding myself. And so the artist generation gives birth to the nomad generation. And the nomad generation is exactly how it sounds. As a kid in the nomad generation, you would have to raise yourself, while your parents were out there finding themselves and protesting the next outrage. You would find what your parents are doing as super cringe, so you say screw the greater good. There's nothing worth fighting for, so you don't worship anything. You don't worship your country, you don't worship social causes like your parents, and you definitely don't worship God. But here's the thing, humans naturally have to worship something, so you end up worshiping yourself. Whereas the last generations were at least fighting for something, war, peace, civil rights, women's rights, this entire generation of nomads would not fight for anything at all, except for their own personal gain. This generation will become known as Generation X. Now imagine every single child in the country getting raised like this. As these kids become young adults, it would be a recipe for decay. It would be a recipe for the unraveling.
Will to the best of my ability. Will to the best of my ability. Preserve, protect, and defend. Preserve, protect, and defend. The Constitution of the United States. The Constitution of the United States.
The awakening awoke people to the fact that not all is well with society. But now that they had done all the fighting, now that they had done all the protesting, now what? It's kind of like if you had a really bad fight with your girlfriend or wife. A fight where you both say all the mean things that you have been holding back all these years. All the things that you'll never be able to take back. Sure, it felt good in the moment, but now that that awakening is over, you make up, you try to move past it, but deep down you know that your relationship is never gonna be the same. And over time you slowly let your relationship rot until you eventually break up. Now imagine that, but scaled up to the entire country. That is the unraveling. It's an ever so slow decay of society where everyone just looks after themselves and no one else. World War II, the American High, and even the Awakening had united Americans behind a common cause. But the unraveling did the exact opposite. It splintered Americans into thousands of niche groups and factions, and things became more polarized than ever. Quote, America's niche group conflict came to be known as the culture wars, defined as a profound division over what kind of country we are, what kind of people we are, and what we mean by the American way of life. Conspiracy theories abound, whether about FBI helicopters buzzing over Idaho, or the CIA spreading AIDS in inner cities. Only 1 American in 5 counted on the president or Congress to act responsibly. It was every man for himself. And no one could be more selfish and self-absorbed than the Generation X nomads who were becoming young adults. They didn't care if their actions hurt America or their community. They weren't gonna sacrifice anything for the good of the people. No, no, no. And the perfect example of this was the rise of the Wall Street yuppies. Young Americans would flock to Wall Street not to contribute to society, but to extract as much money from the masses as possible. It was the age of corporate raiders. Greed is good became the unofficial slogan. And the politicians followed suit. They no longer even pretended to have a sense of duty to serve the people, they were just in it for themselves. And this greed showed in the economy too. The money printer was ramping up, the social programs were getting bigger and more bloated than ever before, the market kept going up and up and up, only to crash bigger than it ever has before in the 1987 Wall Street crash, then the dot-com crash, then came 9/11 and the war on terror. Every boom and bust cycle kept getting bigger and bigger. Then came the real estate bubble, and then it happened.
The stock market suffered one of its worst days in years Monday. Investors reacted to a stunning reshaping of the landscape of Wall Street that took out 2 storied names, Lehman Brothers and Merrill Lynch.
Another anxiety attack on Wall Street. Even after the AIG bailout, the Dow tumbled another 450 points.
The CEOs of those banks still got bonuses.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. They all still got bonuses.
They said they had to give them bonuses, otherwise they would leave and go other places.
It shows a real, like eroding of something completely different than the political system, just our culture, that there wasn't at least like enough shame of those people to just go, yeah, I'm gonna not take my bonus this year. Because I don't want to get dragged through the streets and like killed by the citizens of this country. I don't want to feel like that. And it's not as if these people didn't already have tens of millions of dollars, like they really needed their bonus from this year, or like little Timmy isn't gonna get his Thanksgiving turkey.
A yacht.
Yeah, it's like, no, I want a 5th yacht.
Yeah,
like it was like that level.
Since the 2008 financial crisis, we adopted a policy of inflation. We didn't call it inflation, we called it quantitative easing, but that was just a euphemism for inflation. It's where the Federal Reserve prints money and then buys government bonds.
In 2008, America officially entered the 4th turning, the crisis. And today, we are still deep into the 4th turning with only one way out.
I am asking Congress to amend this bill and increase the ridiculously low $600 to $2,000.
President Biden's $1.9 trillion COVID relief package.
Coming straight from the Fed, we started this period with around $4 trillion in the system. 1 year later, that number is at $6.7 trillion, meaning that over 40% of all US dollars were printed in just the last 12 months.
No, I know what I just described does not come cheaply. Failure to do so will cost us dearly.
And right now, nobody seems to think that this is a problem. People seem to think that we've stumbled on the equivalent of a monetary fountain of youth. People like to call it modern monetary theory, which is we can have whatever we want as long as government prints the money to pay for it, that there's no limit, that government is free as long as they print money.
Ukraine's military says all but one of the drones were intercepted and destroyed. 5 people were wounded, including an 11-year-old girl.
The collapse of First Republic Bank.
Peter, I didn't think I'd see you so soon, but another bank, another shoe drops. Do you have any prediction, and how bad's it going to get?
A lot more banks are going to fail.
signature bank, Silicon Valley Bank.
Switzerland's biggest bank, UBS, has agreed to take over its troubled rival, Credit Suisse.
As fears grow, the Middle East could be on the brink of a wider war.
Remember how a couple years ago everyone was talking about how the market was gonna crash soon? Even we made videos on that. But the market never crashed. Once again, our central planners were able to kick the can down the road one last time. But now it looks like we might finally be running out of road. As you all know, inflation is much higher right now than the government is reporting. So the Fed has finally stopped the money printer and has been raising interest rates to try to stop the inflation. And we have never raised interest rates this fast before. And yet, look around you. Inflation doesn't seem to be going anywhere. Why is this? Well, we brought Peter Schiff back on to ask him.
You know, the Fed was looking at the CPI and they kept saying we don't have enough inflation, it's still below 2%. And so they kept trying to ratchet the rate up to get to 2%. And now, of course, it's way above it. An example that a lot of people can relate to, it's like when you're taking a shower. You get into a shower and the water's too cold. And so you turn up the heat a little bit and then it's still too cold. And then you turn it up a little bit more and it's still too cold. And you keep notching it up. And then all of a sudden it's scalding hot and you burn yourself. And you ended up, turning it up too hot. But there's a lag between turning up the temperature and the water actually heating up and making it out of your faucet. And you keep thinking, I didn't turn it up enough. Didn't turn it up enough because I don't get the immediate effect of the warmer water. And by the time I get the effect, it's too hot and I burn myself. And that's what the Fed was doing. They kept, turning the inflation knob and looking at the CPI and seeing, oh, we're not at 2%. Let's do more. Let's do more. Now, all of a sudden, it's a lag, and now it's not 2%, it's 10%. And,
Okay.
there's nothing they can do now. It's the genie's out of the bottle, and there's no putting it back in.
This is because of the lag effects. All those 40% of US dollars that were printed during COVID, yeah, all that money is still not done working its way through the economy yet. That's why we still have inflation. And on top of that, the high interest rates where people can't afford cars or homes or loans anymore. And guess what? These interest rate hikes also have a lag effect. In fact, every time the Fed has raised rates a lot in the past, there has always been a recession afterwards. But there's a lag. Take a look at this graph. The blue line shows the interest rates. Those black bars are where the Fed stopped raising rates. And these black bars show us how many months it took us to go into a recession. In 2001, it took 8 months for a recession to happen. In 2007, it took 17 months. In 2019, 10 months. So on average, it takes 11 months for a recession to happen. And guess what?
The Federal Reserve today paused its recent interest rate hikes, leaving them unchanged after 10 straight increases.
Yup, our central planner overlords just stopped raising interest rates. People are saying they may raise rates one more time in January, but that's it. And they're gonna start lowering it after that. Which means we are gonna have a recession around 11 to 12 months from now. And we're not saying this because we have a crystal ball. We know this is gonna happen because this is what the central planners want. They say it out loud. So if you think inflation is bad right now when we have high interest rates, wait until the Fed lowers rates again. Okay, how bad do you think the inflation can get?
Well, I mean, it can get much worse, and it will get much worse because there's really no political motivation to stop it, because the only way to stop the inflation really would be to have dramatic cuts in government spending. The government has to get rid of the $2 to $3 trillion or more a year deficits, which means dramatic across the board cuts to government spending, including entitlements like Social Security, Medicare. That's not going to happen. So the Fed's going to have to keep printing money, which means the money is going to keep losing value and prices are going to keep going up faster and faster. And eventually the Fed is going to be printing money and buying bonds to prop up the banking sector, which is completely insolvent right now, thanks to government policy and Fed policy, and to prop up a lot of other things because the economy is close to imploding. And so the Fed is going to try to rescue it by creating inflation, which is always how the Fed reacts. That's the only play in their book. When there's a problem, they create inflation to solve it. Well, in the process, they've created an inflation problem. And now, if they try to use inflation to solve these other problems, they're going to make the inflation problem much, much worse.
So 12 months. You have around 12 months to prepare before things start getting bad. And we're already seeing signs of what's to come.
So
Social Security reserve funds are going to run out by 2034.
One thing that's probably going to happen during the crisis is that if you and your parents were planning on relying on the government to retire, well, good luck, because Social Security is set to run out in the next decade. Which means that most of the masses today are going to be spending their golden years greeting people into Walmart because this stuff is just not sustainable. There's just too many old people, along with all the other financial problems we're about to talk about. This one hits home for me because this was one of the main motivations for me to make money, because my parents were planning on relying on the government to retire. And it's not just America. We're seeing this happen all over the world in places like France, where they just had to raise the retirement age because they can't afford to support these old people. And look at the riots that happened just because of that. Then there's the national debts. Just the interest alone on the national debt is over $2 trillion now.
That means it's going to be the single biggest expense that the government has. It'll be bigger than Social Security and bigger than Medicare. Now, that is an enormous amount of money. And, maybe a year after that, interest on the national debt could be so big that it consumes half of all the income that the government collects in taxes.
Which means it's not going to be just retirement money that's going to run out soon. Soon the government isn't going to be able to afford anything. No more welfare, no more food stamps, government salaries, unless they print more money, which they will try. And again, it's not just the US. This is a global debt crisis. If anything, the US is in a better position because we print the money our debt is owed in.
We've been kicking it down the road really since the 1987 stock market crash. That's when Greenspan first, introduced this playbook, and he and everybody else has been following it ever since. So we've got, a long period, 40 years or so of can kicking almost. So, and during those years, the problems have really, really grown. It'd be like, 40 years, without an earthquake or without a forest fire. And then when you finally get one, it's terrible because, you didn't have the smaller fires or the smaller quakes to take the pressure off or, get rid of some of the dry wood. And so when it happens, it's really bad. So we're going to have a horrible crisis because we were able to postpone it for as long as we did. I mean, we've had many crises along the way, but that was just a small taste of what's coming. And at the end, there's no bailouts, because the Fed has bailed everybody out by creating more inflation, but won't be able to do that anymore without the inflation itself being the problem.
Combine this with the fact that the world is on the verge of a new world war every single week, and political uprisings, food shortages, energy shortages, social unrest, nothing is off the table. And although all this may sound like fear-mongering, when you take a look at the Seculum, you'll see that we're right on schedule. And as always, when this crisis comes, it will be the poor and the middle class that suffer the most, and all their last remaining wealth will just get transferred to the rich, just like COVID. But if you don't want this to be your fate, the good news is that you still have time to prepare. You got 12 months before a recession, thanks to the lag effects, before things start getting really bad. And if you want to prepare, it's safe to say that the average 9-to-5 job where you can get laid off at any moment is not going to cut it. And 12 months sounds like a lot of time to prepare, right? Wrong! Think about how quickly this last year flew by. It's December already. And yet most people will wait until January to start working on their goals. And by the time February rolls around, they will already have let off the gas. And then what do you know, it's June already, halfway through the year, and at the rate of how fast things are moving, who knows how the world is going to change by then. So if you really want to prepare, if you really want to make sure you come out on top, you have to start preparing in this literal moments. We're talking about what are you going to do in the next hour, or tomorrow, or the next few days. Hint hint, you should make sure you watch part 2 and part 3. Our parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents may have gotten us into this mess, but it's our duty to make sure we come out on top. The last crisis we had was World War II. At that time, FDR was president. And you know what he said about the hero generation back then?
There is a mysterious cycle in human events. To some generations, much is given. Of other generations, much is expected. But this generation has a rendezvous with destiny.
You watching this right now are the hero in this crisis, and it's time for your rendezvous with destiny. And in part 2 of this docu-series that's dropping this Friday, we're gonna go over exactly what you need to navigate this crisis so that you can make sure you come out on top. So click the card on the screen now to be the first to know when part 2 drops. Click the card on the screen now, and don't forget to always stay dangerous.